Previously on Transformers University, we took a look at the conditions of the world in 1984 that led to the popularity of the Transformers, and we sat down with Jim Shooter, former Marvel editor-in-chief and creator of the Transformers backstory, as today we launch to what it was all for, to promote a toy line on Transformers University. Hello, my friend, and welcome to Transformers University, a TFU.INFO podcast. I am your host, Anthony Brutali, and today we take a look at the first year of the toy line. We head back to 1984, and we look at what everything was done for, what the cartoons, the comics, and everything else that went with it as far as marketing materials go and world building goes. It was to sell toys, and so we're going to look at those toys. And speaking of selling toys, I hope you really enjoyed that interview we did with Jim Shooter in the last episode. It was a lot of fun to do. It was great to meet him and chat with him for a bit. And one of the things he mentioned in reference to G.I. Joe was that they would make a commercial to run in the show for the comic book to kind of skirt around the laws of advertising within the show for the toys that are being marketed on the show. And Transformers was no different. The first Transformers commercial, from what I can dig up, using the internet and tfwiki.net. If you don't know about tfwiki.net, it will be a huge resource to you if this is something you find interesting. The first commercial for Transformers didn't even show any toys.
It is a world transformed, where things are not what they seem. It is the world of the Transformers.
The Transformers, more than meets the eye. Autobots wage their battle to destroy the evil forces of the Decepticons. Transformers, robots in disguise. The Transformers, more than meets the eye.
The Transformers from Marvel Comics.
And it's interesting to note in that spot that the animation of Optimus Prime transforms and forms into the pose that is on the first cover of Marvel #1 Transformers. And kind of neat. So let's take a look at what made up the 1984 Transformers toy line. Now, I could do a whole episode on pre-Transformers, and maybe I will. Shoot me an email. info@tfu.info, or hit me up on Twitter at_tfu. Whoa, got my Twitter wrong. @TFU_info. And let me know what you think. If you want an episode on pre-Transformers, I know a few good people for this, and it would be great to do a conversation on that. But as of right now, let's just touch on this very briefly, because I want to focus from 84 on, and I don't want to take too far of a step back. But the main thrust of the Transformers toy line in 1984 came from two failed toy lines by Takara in Japan. Now, many of you might know Takara is kind of Transformers. Actually, not kinda. Takara is Hasbro's partner on Transformers for the entire run of the series and of the toy line, and they help engineer the robot figures from one form to another, and they're integral in the design process and the creation of the toys. And Transformers originally came from two failed Takara toy lines, mainly. And those two toy lines are Micro Change, which was part of the Microman series, and those toys were mainly role-play toys. They were the kind of toys you would see that would transform into objects. So they would turn into, for example, Megatron turns into a gun. So kids can role-play and play, guns with it. And Soundwave turned into a cassette deck, and he had his cassettes, and those turned into things that were very realistic looking and almost scale to life. A little smaller, but the idea was that it was meant for kids to play with. Those toys came out of the Micro Change line, as well as the Minibots, and we'll get to those in just a little bit. The rest of the line came from a series of toys called Diaclone. Now, Diaclone were piloted robots, so there were these robots that had little pilot toy men that had magnets on their feet, and those magnets would allow them to attach to the die-cast metal in the toy's construction, and would secure them in the seat. And so those toys in the first year were Optimus Prime and the Autobot Cars and the Decepticon Jets, and there would be more Diaclone toys added in the next year. But for now, let's focus on 1984. And just as another note, we're only going to focus on United States releases, so USA releases only, just for the time being, just for simplicity's sake and for sake of length of the show. And we can certainly bunch some of that other great stuff from around the world into some other future shows. But before we start with the Autobots, we need to talk about one other thing that's very important, and that is the tech spec bios that were included on the packaging for the toys. This was something that was starting to trend in the early 80s. It started with, I wouldn't say it started with G.I. Joe, but as far as Hasbro's concerned, it was part of their makeup for G.I. Joe and their success with G.I. Joe, so they ported it over to Transformers, in that allowing a Marvel writer, in this case Bob Budiansky, who was the writer of the comic, to develop these characters for the cartoon, for the comic, and for the toy, and kind of have them be lined up in each one. And there were some mistakes, which we'll get into, which is some more interesting stuff about the tech spec bios. But these bios also gave kids a chance to kind of preview who their toy was, and kind of develop, play patterns around parameters set forth on the back of the packaging. And that's very interesting, because it wasn't so freeform. You could say maybe it takes some of the imagination out of it, because you're not starting from scratch. But for some kids, and even for me as a child, it helped. It added a realm of framework to the play pattern, and it gave you an idea of, okay, well, this guy is this, and this person has this attitude, and this person thinks this way, and certainly lined a lot of things up to make each toy interesting before you even bought it, because you could look at the back of the package and say, I don't kind of like this guy. I don't like what he sounds like. I'm going to find someone else. And so the toy bios are very important to the nature of the toy and the character it represents. So we will punch into the bios every so often when we talk about the toys. Now, let's start with the Autobots. And the smallest and simplest wave of the Autobots were the Minibots. Now, these retailed for about $3, and they were based from a Takara toy line as well. They were from Micro Change, and the Micro Change toys were actually based on another Takara toy line called Chorokyu. But in the United States, that Chorokyu line was brought here as penny racers.
20 zany-looking cars you can collect. 6 of them glow in the dark, each sold separately.
That's Penny Racers.
Sun Devil and Grizzly Gasser, penny for each car, not included.
No cost to wearing.
That's Penny Racers.
Classy cars you can race and chase. F1 Dragon and Moon Van glow in the dark.
It glows. Look at it glow.
That's the Penny Racers.
Penny Racers, Sun Devil, Grizzly Gasser, F1 Dragon and Moon Van, each sold separately from Takara.
And important to note in that commercial, the penny is not included with the penny racers. And for those not familiar with the toys, so they were little super deformed cars that had pullback motors, and you could slide a penny in the back of this little section behind the spoiler, behind the trunk, and it would weight the car down slightly so that you could do tricks with it. So it would pop a wheelie, or it would roll in a circle of some kind, depending on how you place the penny. So based off of that, the Minibots were created in that same vein for their vehicle forms. And the most famous of these Minibots, and arguably one of the most famous Transformers of all time, probably top 3, is Bumblebee. And the first Bumblebee character and the first Bumblebee toy was part of this Minibots assortment. And he was the Kid Appeal character in the show. Going off the toy bio, he was the Kid Appeal character there as well. And his toy bio, the quote was particularly important when it says, "The least likely can be the most dangerous." And it goes on to talk about how Bumblebee idolizes the bigger and the stronger Autobots, and is super brave but requires stealth because he is also the weakest. And if that doesn't speak to a kid in a world of adults where you're told you're too small, you're too little, you're too this, you're too that, that is the appeal of Bumblebee right off the bat to kids. And that is why he's probably the most important character in this Minibots assortment. He's also the one closest to looking like a Penny Racer's toy, in that the flap that folds out to form his head is about the same size as the little slot that was used for the penny in the Penny Racers. Now, that transformation is pretty basic for Bumblebee. It's pull out his arms, extend the front part of the car to form his upper legs, and then fold the front end of the car up to form his feet. And there you have it. Now, he varied wildly from his depiction on screen in the show, in that his wheels were attached to his arms on the toys. So most of the artwork you'd see in the comics and in the show would eventually reflect the cartoon design, where his wheels are hidden, and he's a little bit more proportionate to human features. His head would also have a addition of horns, which are kind of on the toy, but aren't so pronounced in the face sculpt. Also, similar to Bumblebee, there was also Cliffjumper, and Cliffjumper shared a very similar mold to Bumblebee, same transformation, and he was red. He turned to a super deformed Porsche, and he was kind of a mold mate to Bumblebee. And the interesting thing here with the Cliffjumper and Bumblebee toys is that while Bumblebee was yellow and Cliffjumper was red, Hasbro manufactured Bumblebee also in red and Cliffjumper also in yellow to make the line look bigger, as noted by a former Hasbro executive in an interview. So in that, we get our first big variant that kids weren't quite clued into like they were now. There's no website telling you that, yeah, there's two versions. It was just, you saw it in the store, you said, wow, that Bumblebee's red, or hey, that Cliffjumper is yellow. Why? And in addition to that, there was a fifth toy that was often packaged as Bumblebee or Cliffjumper, and that has been subsequently named Bumper, though through the years in the fandom it was also called Bumblejumper or Cliffbee. But Bumper is actually a completely different mold that never got a name as far as the Transformers toy line goes, but it was the sedan from the Micro Change line in yellow with a completely different face, but a same transformation as the other two toys. And so it's also worth noting that because he was only included in the 1984 line, whereas the rest of the Minibots were released again in 1985, Bumper is probably the hardest to find of the Minibot figures. Moving on, there was Brawn, who was a green truck and was the strong guy, as noted by his tech bio. And this is something interesting, that the large green guy in Transformers tends to be the strong man later on in various fictions. So you have Brawn, and later on in Transformers Animated you'll have Bulkhead, as well as the Bulkhead in Transformers Prime, who's a different character but also the green strongman. And then even in the 2015 Robots in Disguise series, Grimlock is the green dinosaur, who is also the strongest member of the team. With the Minibots, you also have Huffer, an orange truck cab, and Gears, who is a blue truck, both super deformed. Both characters are presented as somewhat cranky in various different ways. And the Gears toy is important because it's what I like to call a fold mold. I'm sure there are better fan terms for this, but it's one where you pop out the arms and you fold the legs over and you have a robot. The front underside of the car is the robot head. The arms and shoulders form out of the front wheels, and the feet form from the trunk and rear area of the car by being hinged at the knee and standing the toy up. And this is something you'll see for years and years and years later as one of the most efficient and basic Transformers transformations. And one other like that also shares that kind of transformation, and the final Minibot in the series is Windcharger. And for more on Windcharger, we toss it over to Radio Free Cybertron's own Headmaster Don.
Windcharger is one of the simplest Transformers ever, but it is also one of my favorite. He got so little screen time, but I just love the figure and I love the character.
Thanks, Don, for that insight. And if you want to catch more of Don and the Radio Free Cybertron gang, please be sure to check out their podcast, Radio Free Cybertron. You can find that at www.tfradio.net. And really, what else can you say about Windcharger? He had a neat toy. It was a red car, and didn't get a lot of screen time. And he's the basic fold mold kind of Transformer that proliferated in the early 80s at the dawn of these transforming toys. And it's important to note that because these Minibots are kind of the early foundation for just about everything else to come, because they needed to be simple, they needed to be small, they needed to look like two different things. And they certainly set the tone for what the other figures in the future would be.
We're under attack! It's the Decepticon! Get more Autobots!
Alright, so let's talk more Autobots. And let's talk about the Autobot Cars. Now, these were all designed out of the Diaclone line, and were mostly straight repaints, or even just brought over with some slight color changes or sticker changes. And we're going to start with Sunstreaker. Now, Sunstreaker is believed to be the first Transformers toy ever designed to go from car and to robot. And this was just designed by Takara. It was originally designed in red, and a police version, which was white with police bars on it. And this toy transforms from basically a flat Lamborghini-style car, because it's not an actual real Lamborghini. It's a modified one with engines on its back. Sunstreaker transforms by pulling the legs out, flipping them up, unfolding the fists from inside the underbody of the vehicle, and then flipping the top down to reveal the head. And the fists actually are a separate piece that need to be plugged into the arms. In the Japanese versions, a lot of the plug-in missiles and fists and things like that were spring-loaded. But due to safety regulations in the United States, those springs were either removed or neutered to be very weak so that they could pass safety tests in the U.S. So the Japanese versions tend to have stronger, more powerful springs, or the U.S. versions tend to not have springs at all. So that was basically Sunstreaker, and you could put a missile into his forearm wrist socket, or you could put a fist in there, and he had his fists, and he had his shoulder mount missiles as well. And going from Sunstreaker to Sideswipe, in the fiction, those two were brothers. Now, Sideswipe tends to be very similar to a fold mold in that the back of his legs don't fold over, but they just separate and pull back. You flip down the feet, you pull out the arms from the side, and you flip over the chest, the hood of the car to form the chest. This is another Transformers design that has persisted through the years. And being the red Lamborghini, Sideswipe is often one of the more popular characters in the fiction and in the toy lines throughout. Now, it's interesting to note with Sideswipe and Sunstreaker a couple of things. First off, with Sunstreaker, the red Diaclone version was released in the US prior to Transformers coming out under the Diacron toy line. So there are versions of that floating around, but they do exist prior to the Transformers toy line, so they aren't actually, that figure isn't actually a Transformer per se. Next mold we're going to talk about is the mold used for both Prowl and Bluestreak, and for more on that, we're going to go to the Gamer Going Gray with more.
Bluestreak, like most of the Autobots from the 1984 toy line, was a repurposed Diaclone toy. Based on the Datsun 280ZX, he sports a striking silver and black color scheme with use of red highlights throughout. From vehicle to robot mode, the transformation is simple. The doors fold out into makeshift wings, the rear folds downward and twists into the stationary legs and feet, and the semi-articulated arms unfold from the undercarriage, allowing the hood to hinge down, revealing the head. He comes with 2 shoulder-mounted missile launchers and a silver gun. Quality-wise, Bluestreak suffers from the malady that many of the Diaclone figures do. He holds together like cinder blocks tied with tissue paper. Many second-hand figures can be found with the doors, roof, or rear windows missing due to breakage. The missile launchers also rarely fire, but luckily hold the missiles nicely in place. One perpetuating misconception of Transformers lore is the presence of a blue Streak toy. No sealed and boxed figures have ever been found, yet most likely due to the blue Diaclone variant being photographed in the original catalog, people have memories of playing with the figure.
And you can catch more from David on his YouTube channel at youtube.com/bluestreak7. That's youtube.com/bluestreak and the number 7. And that's a great point David brings up, in that the blue streak is still one of the biggest myths in the Transformers fandom. And those toy catalogs certainly fueled a lot of that. But those were also a lot of fun to look at when you were a kid, to see what else was out there. And certainly fueled a lot of imaginations as to what the toys do and what the toys look like. Going from Blue Streak, like David mentioned, there was Prowl, and Prowl was the same toy for the most part, just with a different color scheme and added police lights. Also, similar transformation to those two was Jazz. And Jazz is the Autobot car that turns into a Porsche. He's white with various stickers on him, including for Martini Racing, which they added a second I to avoid copyright laws, because there is an actual Martini Racing. And it's important to note the Jazz and the Prowl and Blue Streak transformations, in that the doors as wings is another persistent design theme throughout the Transformers toy line and Transformers history. And those three toys all have it. The hood, as a way to hide the arms, and the tires being used as the shoulder pivot point, are all part of that. And the Jazz toy would later be offered without the Martini Racing stickers, as a giveaway from Cookie Crisp cereal. Now, another important character who had or pair of characters really, that had a toy that was vastly different from their show model and their cartoon model, and even in the comics beyond a couple of panels, were Ratchet and Ironhide. And Ironhide was portrayed in the toy bio as being Optimus Prime's bodyguard, and the character itself was a bit of a veteran amongst the Autobots. And for more on that, I'm going to toss to another veteran, my friend Gabe Owens, also known as the Salty Seaman.
Of all the iconic characters in the original 1984 line, none undergone more transition from the toys to fiction, possibly, than Ironhide and Ratchet. The original toys are based on an early 80s Japanese van, that which both modes, the original toys and the fictionalized versions from the cartoon and comic, stay pretty much the same. Ironhide is a red van, and Ratchet is a redo of him as an ambulance, complete with with the ambulance top on it. The robot modes, however, are a completely different story. What you're looking at there is the original toys they did not have faces. They had the windshield popped up that kind of acted as a face, and they had these big old tire treads, or almost like tank treads for legs. Of course, people growing up with the cartoon remember Ironhide and Ratchet having very, unique and recognizable faces. The windshield was down on their chest, and from pretty much then on out, that's the look they had. That no one really ever paid much attention to those original toys. Which also, besides that, they also had kind of the shell basically acted as a kind of a med kit for Ratchet, and I guess a war kit for Ironhide. But you only, both those modes you saw briefly in the in the very early comics, like the first 2 issues, and then they switched to the designs that were used in the what everyone knows from the cartoon. And I think it's kind of a shame we don't see a return to that a little bit. Mostly today, they talk Ironhide and Ratchet, or you see new toy versions of them. They're always based on the television designs. And I think the original toy designs are pretty neat. They have a very kind of creepy alien robot vibe, which I think I like because these are alien robots. They don't need to have human-looking faces. I think things that made like Shockwave and Whirl, the next year's line, stand out. It's kind of that complete kind of inhumanness, which I think, I think those two toys really gave the line. But unfortunately, and they're fairly decent toys for their time as well. But yeah, they don't get the kind of love I think they probably deserve.
And you can catch more from Gabe on YouTube at youtube.com/recharge138. That is youtube.com/recharge138 for his channel, The Salty Seaman. And Ratchet and Ironhide certainly didn't get much love when it comes to their toy design. In fact, the repair bay for both of them only showed up a handful of times, particularly in Marvel Comics #1, when the characters are introduced. Some other odd artwork that we'll talk about later on, various coloring books and things like that. And once in the first episode of the Transformers cartoon do we see the repair bay from the toy, which has gone on to be unofficially referred to as the one-box component, as per tfwiki.net. And that is a reference to the car's design in that it is a one-box style van for both Ironhide and Ratchet, and that the engine, the trunk, and the passenger compartments all kind of fit into one piece, whereas in most cars they would be what's called a three-box design, where the engine and the trunk would be separate sections from the passenger area. Moving on to Wheeljack, who is often paired with Ratchet in the fiction as being the mechanical engineer, the mad scientist of the Autobots. He varied a bit from his show model in the toy as a Lancia Stratos with Alitalia, also misspelled, stickers on his car. And show model didn't have two shoulder-mounted launchers, whereas the toy did. And Wheeljack is the one mold which had a Diaclone retooling of Marlboro Wheeljack, known as Marlboro, as per the packaging, and later as the Decepticon exhaust in the Masterpiece line, where it was Wheeljack with a different head and painted to look like a pack of Marlboro cigarettes. And you can actually see pictures of this Marlboro Wheeljack on my site at TFU.INFO, and I'll include that link in the show notes for this show, so you can go right there. But if you Google Marlboro Wheeljack, the TFU.INFO link will be one of the first ones you see. Another toy that didn't really didn't have a counterpart as far as its mold was Mirage. And Mirage is a very special toy to a lot of fans. It's actually a pretty good toy as far as the posability of the arms and interesting transformation and just color scheme and design are. But it's particularly a special toy to Radio Free Cybertron's Brian Kilby.
It was 1984, and my God, I was so happy. It was Christmas, and I was just so anxious, and my hands were sweaty, and I just didn't know what to do. I ripped her open and just got my hands on it, and then pop! Just prematurely just lost it forever. Mirage, I'll always remember breaking that Transformer. It haunts me to this day.
And that's what I hear from a lot of fans, that Mirage toy broke very easily. I didn't have one as a kid. I had one as an adult, so I've been very careful as to not break that toy. But I guess it's the hip area of that toy rotates 360, and it's needed to turn the back end of the car around to form the feet and the legs, and it just pops, and that's what happens. Another toy that really didn't break that easily because it was so small and so compact was Hound. And Hound in the cartoon seemed to appear to be the Kid Appeal character in the first few episodes before shifting to Bumblebee. Hound's a green Jeep, and he has very short arms, more so than any other toy in this year. It comes with a lot of accessories, a vehicle-mounted gun, a gas can, a tire, his shoulder-mounted weapon, 3 missiles for that, and a handgun as well. And he's kind of one of the more bland toys from '84 and from the Diaclone line. Moving on, the last of the Autobot cars that we'll talk about today is Trailbreaker. And Trailbreaker was a black SUV. And similar to Sunstreaker, his fists were not attached. They were added in as missiles that you plug into his forearms, as well as the metal component you plug behind his head. And he was very similar in transformation to Sideswipe in that you pull out the side panels to form his arms, you flip out his legs, you move his hood to become his chest, and his head reveals from the passenger compartment. And Trailbreaker is interesting, and along with Sunstreaker, and to bring this full circle, in that the fists attaching to the wrists are what has become called parts forming in the Transformers fandom. Now, parts forming means that the change in appearance from vehicle to robot or vice versa requires physically removing a piece and placing it somewhere else, as opposed to a piece shifting while still being attached. And another figure, and this is probably the most popular and most important figure, and the main character of the Transformers brand, that had a little bit of parts forming and a little bit of everything, was Optimus Prime. Now, Optimus Prime was the largest of the Autobots introduced in 1984. He was in scale with the rest of the cars. He had a trailer. He had a drone named Roller. And actually, some of the Autobot cars could even fit in his trailer. Now, Optimus Prime also transformed with a little bit of parts forming in that you would have to plug his fists in. There are a number of variations on those fists and on Roller. Roller came in blue and gray, and those fists came in various sizes. His trailer turned into a repair bay, which could be used both laying down or standing up, and could launch Roller from the center ramp.
Attack the Autobot commander! Call in the Decepticon leader!
And that Decepticon leader was Megatron. Now, Megatron was from the Micro Change line, so we're shifting gears here from Diaclone back to Micro Change. And he turned into a gun. And as I mentioned earlier, this was more of the role-playing aspect of some of the earlier Transformers toys. And it's a toy you would never see today in the United States because of gun laws, because he looks too realistic and too much like a P-38 Walther. He had a lot of parts. He had a silencer and a scope and a handle. And those parts actually combined to form a stand-up weapon that you could put in front of Megatron. His transformation, much like a lot of the early toys, didn't really match his show model, but he's certainly a very interesting toy in that it is something you will never see again. In order to even make that toy today, he would have to be a series of very bright, very distinct colors, and even then it'd be questionable. Back in the early 2000s, they had toyed with the idea of making Megatron, and it's often referred to as Safety Megatron. He was blue and neon orange, and there was just simply, and even now I don't even know if that would pass legally to be released in the U.S. Also of note, though we are sticking with the U.S. toys, the U.S. version did not have the pellet firing feature that was in the original pre-Transformers version or subsequent Japanese versions, where you could load a little plastic pellet into Megatron and pull the trigger and fire them.
It's the Decepticon communicators! Get more Autobots!
Also in the Decepticon ranks in 1984, another toy that was very popular in the day was Soundwave. Now, Soundwave turned into a micro cassette player and interacted with the micro cassette toys that were also released. Even came with one, Buzzsaw, the gold Condor. who turned into a micro cassette. And there were some nice features on Soundwave that really hold up even today. The toy had a lot of articulation: knees, hips, not hips, but thighs, elbows, his head, even to some extent his ankles, his shoulders. The toy, for what is essentially a rectangle that turns into a robot, has a lot of places where it can move and be posed. Additionally, the batteries that slide into the battery compartment in the back, much like a real portable cassette player, turn into his shoulder-mounted cannon and his handgun. The cassettes can fit into his chest, and the door opens with a spring latch. And included with him was Buzzsaw, who didn't get a lot of notoriety being on the show because he was often paired with Laserbeak. Now, Laserbeak's an important character overall, and the toy is straight repaint of the Buzzsaw toy, only in red. And also he turns into a condor. And it's important to note here, especially with the micro cassettes, and we'll probably jump to Ravage here. Ravage turned into a Jaguar, black cassette, black Jaguar. And Laserbeak, Buzzsaw, Ravage, these are the first toys that turn into beasts and have an alternate mode. They're robotic beasts, and they turn into cassettes. And it was a point of controversy later on whether or not Transformers should turn into beasts during the introduction of Beast Wars in the mid-90s. And we'll discuss that when we get to it. But it's important to note here that it was established from day one that Transformers do turn into beasts. Rounding out the micro cassettes are Rumble and Frenzy. Now, Rumble and Frenzy turn into robots from cassettes, and depending on whether you believe the toy packaging or the cartoon, Rumble may or may not be red, Frenzy may or may not be blue, or vice versa. But as they were sold as toys, the blue one is Frenzy, and the red one, red and black one, that is Rumble. And then rounding out the Decepticon toys for 1984 are
Starscream and the Jets.
Now, the Decepticon Jets are the last part we'll talk here in this episode, and they are carryovers from the Diaclone line, which is why they have a cockpit to sit a Diaclone figure. And these represent three characters. They're all based off the same mold, and they're all made from the same mold. And that is Starscream, the Decepticon Air Commander, Skywarp, and Thundercracker. And these are probably the biggest culprit in parts forming in the early years, in that the toy basically unfolds the arms from the midsection of the fuselage of the jet. The cockpit forms the chest and the head as the nose cone flips back, and the feet fold out from the back of the fuselage, and then the wings reattach, the fists attach, and the weapons attach by removing them and placing them on the figure. It's also important to note that this trio, which would eventually be called the Seekers, but not officially for a very long time, is one you'll commonly see today, in that if they make a Starscream, it'll ultimately become a Skywarp and a Thundercracker. It doesn't always happen, but it almost always happens. Also worth noting on the bios for these figures, Skywarp's tech spec numbers seem maybe to have been flipped with Starscream's, as his rank is a much higher number than Starscream's, and Starscream is the Air Commander. And Thundercracker is noted to be not convinced of the Decepticon cause, which is used in his characterization in the IDW publishing comics today, and a very important and integral part to why he's become a fan favorite. And that pretty much wraps up the 1984 toy line. Of note in general is how Transformers toys came into the world. They represented a number of play patterns, because you could play cars and you can play action figures, and you can switch between the two at will, which certainly fueled the imaginations of many kids in the 80s and all the way through today. And probably why these toys had such a huge impact and still carry on today as some of the most important characters in the history of the show and of the toys. And that will wrap up today's show. I am your host, Anthony Brucali of TFU.INFO. Please be sure to help the site and help the show by swinging by our Amazon link at www.tfu.info/Amazon. And just remember, anything you buy from Amazon at that point, they'll kick back a few pennies to us and help us. Moreover, if you want to help the site, if you want to help TFU.info with some images, because we are always looking for toy pictures, especially from some of the more modern toy lines from around the world, please swing by tfu.info/help, and that'll give you all the ways you can help both the site and the podcast. I am your host, Anthony Brucali. You can catch me on Twitter at TFU_info, on Facebook at facebook.com/TFU.INFO, and you can always shoot us an email at info@tfu.info. Thanks for listening to the show. We've got more coming up soon. See ya.